Hello, everyone. My name, of course, is Dr. Julie Tuman. Welcome to another beautiful day, right? We're all blessed to be here. It's always a blessing to be live, so we should all remember that. So I wanted to come on and have a little conversation about a topic that's really important in healing, and especially if we're going to have a conversation about, the broader scope and impact of exhaustion and thyroid issues and inflammation, because it's something that gets missed a lot. And I think it gets missed because we don't always have a great perception of the totality of how the cells actually work. And from my perception, actually, there's a lot of really bad understanding of how the cells work and what's really needed to heal them. And, the funny thing is that a lot of the best studies on how the body works were actually conducted back in like the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then it's like big science took over. And so the studies that have been done are ones that lead to things that can be charged for. And so as a result, they're not researching the body from a perception of health anymore. They're researching it from a place of disease. And that is a big negative. And it's why a lot of people are never going to heal, is because the establishment doesn't have an interest in healing. They have an interest in disease management. And those are very different things. So, when we talk about energy, I think it's really important that we talk about like what fatigue really is. So it is physical slowdown. So it's an actual sense of there's not enough energy to be able to propel me. And this is a Chinese medicine concept for sure, because in essence in Chinese medicine, fatigue is a lack of qi, and qi being the vital force, the thing that sustains us. It's the movement, it's the information coming from our origin. And that qi comes from a lot of places in us, right? So it can come from our food. A good portion of our qi is actually supposed to come from our food, so that we're able to, in essence, grab what we need out of what we do every day. And then there's some that comes from our breath, and some that comes from movement that is mindful, not from exercise, you guys, but from movement that's mindful. And we generate qi from resting. So those are things that generate qi. And a lot of times, if we're not doing those in sufficient amounts, then what happens is we start to actually need to draw on our reserves. And that's where we enter the stress-based metabolism, and that's where everything goes sideways. So it's really important to understand that. But fatigue is also, inflammatory, mitigated rapid aging. So when the cells get tired, they immediately actually succumb to the effects of inflammation, and then they start to rapidly age, which means they can actually get rigid. They don't send signals. Their components start to dysfunction. We get imbalances in acid-base relationship inside and outside the cell. The cell membranes themselves don't become so functional. Hi, Al. We start to have real dysfunction in the actual ability of the cell to even send the message. And that includes being able to respond to messages. So if we're talking, neurotransmitters need to interact with the cell, but the cell's in a fatigued state, you guys, it's not going to be able to respond. If we're talking thyroid hormones need to be able to interact with the cell, but the cell's in a fatigued state, it's not going to respond. And those same things translate out to the ability of insulin to respond effectively to the cell, the ability of the cells to utilize proteins and fats. It's all related to this. So it's a key thing that once we get to that rapid age state of an inflamed cell, because there isn't enough qi to support it, you guys, we're in a totally different category at that point. It's also, though, that then that leads to hormonal disruption, because I was just talking about it. If you can't send the signals, you don't have functional hormonal systems. And this is why a lot of people have been told that they have totally functional thyroids, for example, when they don't have functional thyroids. What's happening is that the signaling from the pituitary appears quote unquote normal, although we could have a big conversation about what normal lab ranges are, because that's another whole ball of wax. But the gist being that a lot of people get told, no, you don't have a thyroid problem. And maybe their lab values are normal, but there's a problem at the cell and even being able to enact the message. And that's another whole level. And that's the problem with fatigued, exhausted, aging cells, that even when the thyroid sends enough hormone, or maybe you're taking thyroid, right? Maybe you've been given Armour or Synthroid or some other natural thyroid, and you're thinking, why isn't it working? Well, part of the thing is that exhausted cells, they can't respond to those messages because they don't have the resources to do so. So it creates a really complicated picture, and that's where fatigue, what I call fatigue or exhaustion, comes in. And this is also why sometimes, you guys, this doesn't present as actual fatigue. So sometimes it presents as inflammation, sometimes it presents as pain, sometimes it's digestive problems, sometimes it's breathing problems. Asthma is directly related to this. Sometimes it's sleep issues, sometimes it's cognitive issues. It's a foggy brain, you know, it's just feeling like you can't function. These are all patterns of exhaustion, even if you're not tired. And there may be a really good reason why you're not tired, and that may be because you are still running on enough stress hormone that you think you're good, when in fact your cells are extremely exhausted, but your body is still making enough stress hormone to make you feel propelled forward. So in essence, you've got your body's version of Red Bull still raging in your system, and it's driving you. And I will tell you that this is why so many people love like all the techniques that raise those stress hormones, because they give them a false sense of energy and they allow for functionality when in reality, if you were going by the base level of someone's cell function, they shouldn't be functioning at that level. So, and this is a big topic when it comes to adrenals. So I know that a lot of times, you know, people will say, okay, that's your adrenal glands, which it is, but so in the body, if we just, let me just first give you the Chinese medicine. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. In Chinese medicine, the kidneys are a very deep layer of the body. And in fact, your kidney qi is very much so a treasure. You're really not supposed to use it. Really, in classical Chinese medicine, that is, it's almost like they shake their finger at you and tell you like, you're not supposed to use that kidney qi. You're supposed to be able to get enough qi from the power of your spleen to be able to take what you eat and grab the nutrients out of it. And then your lungs, the qi you generate from breath, and the qi you generate from intentional movement. Those are supposed to be enough. And when they're not, you turn to the kidneys. Now, let's take that in context of this whole stress-based model, because everyone wants to say like, oh, you've got adrenal insufficiency, you've got adrenal fatigue. We need to treat the adrenals. But do you? Because if you think about it, and we take that Chinese medicine model, and then we take this understanding, when we drive too hard, we always inadvertently raise the stress response, right? And I know you all have experienced it. You know what stress feels like when you felt it acutely. So we know when we're doing it acutely, and we say, yeah, I remember being really stressed, or I'm really stressed right now, I'm going through a really tough time. The thing is that we are so biologically adapted to survive, sorry for the phone ringing in the background, that we are positioned that the more that stress response happens, we actually become cognitively disconnected from it. So we don't notice that we're stressed. And in fact, we don't notice it to the point where it becomes normal. So when it becomes normal, we are in a new state of function. What that means from this state is that we've drawn down, we've bypassed the rest of the endocrine system, and we've gone straight to adrenal function. So from that Chinese medicine perspective, we are now drawing on the deepest, most reserved level that we are supposed to have. You want to know why that is? It's because that's emergency power. So we do need cortisol. You use it every single day, you guys. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory substance in your body when regulated well. And the other adrenal hormones have profound effects. But if we turn to the adrenals as the primary source of fuel, it is like turning to your reserve power system. Now, you guys have all seen someone use a generator, or you've used one yourself, right? So when you run a generator to run your house because the power's out, you can't run everything, right? You have to pick, like, oh, we're going to run the fridge so we don't lose all the food, and we're going to run this and this. But you can't just go and turn on all the lights in the house and run everything and run 4 TVs and 5 computers and the washer. You can't do it because reserve power is reserve power. It is not meant to power the entire structure at its optimal. And this is what stress-based metabolism is. It is reserve power. So that's how we live a lot of our life. So then a lot of people say, okay, well, let's treat the adrenals. Well, the problem there is that you start to turn off that stress response. You haven't put it in place, anything to replace it, you are going to have an issue. Because the fact is that over time, the more you exist in that stress response state, which I got news for you, I think most adults over 40 have been living there since their mid-20s. Once you have been living in that state, it isn't just like you flipped one switch, now you're going to go flip another one. you turn off that adrenal stress response. You have to have something to replace it, but your cells have been functioning in that mode for a long time, and there's been damage. So your adrenal responses have damaged the cell response by you making the cells run off of stress hormones. Now, what's some of the consequences of that? Well, stress-based metabolism produces lactic acid, produces nitric oxide, where a non-stress-based metabolism produces carbon dioxide and ATP. These are vastly different things. Nitric oxide is pro-inflammatory, lactic acid is pro-inflammatory. It causes, not to mention that the stress-based metabolism causes rises in pathological estrogen production. Angie, I'll totally get to that. It causes a pathological estrogen production, which also causes fibrosis. That fibrosis causes restriction and non-movement in the tissues, and it can block the ability of the thyroid to even reach the tissues. So it becomes really, really complicated. And as that goes on, now you've got restrictions all over the body. So you turn off the adrenal response. Let's say you turn to some of the popular methods, right? And these are all great. So I'm not diminishing these methods. I'm just saying that if you don't have something in place, you're going to end up in a problem. So maybe you turn to regular meditation, which is awesome, or breath work, or maybe you start taking certain adaptogens. Those are really popular. High-dose B vitamins. Sometimes high-dose vitamin C is used. You might start doing these things. And you start to lower the cortisol response. But your cells are sitting there saying, what about us? Because their favorite fuel source is dictated by thyroid being able to initiate mitochondrial work, and by having enough carbohydrates available, and by having enough substrates for the mitochondria to do their job, and by having sufficient levels of amino acids, and all of these things. And if that's not there first, before you start to do a big switch and turn off that response, then what's going to happen is your body's going to be totally unregulated. It's not going to know how to use blood sugar. It's not going to know how to use thyroid. It's not going to know how to run the cell. Not to mention that all that fibrosis that's been collecting because the stress response leads to fibrosis is standing in the way. It's almost like, in some cases, it's like the cell is encased in a wall of fibrosis. And so anything trying to get in just keeps hitting the wall. And this is where the problem is. Not to mention that the longer that the body's been in that state, the weaker and weaker these other organ systems are and these glandular systems. And so when you suddenly turn off one and there's nothing built there to replace it, you don't have an option B. You can't go back to the original template because it hasn't been healed. So Angie asks, how do you treat the adrenals and not use them as a power source? So you have to start to repair the mechanism. The mechanism of proper cell function is based off of a couple things. So it's having sufficient carbohydrates balanced for your body. It's having good quality proteins that are not too phosphorus rich, because that can send you, again, down another pathway. It's having high mineral density foods, because all those cellular processes are actually based on massive mineral density in your food choices. It's having sufficient sleep, but it's also having sufficient rest. Those are two different things. So rest is actually even more of a mindset than it is an action. So it's approaching life from I'm not going to do anything fast that I don't have to do fast, and processing things in a way that allows for ease rather than continuing the story. This proper cell function also requires that you have movement, but not stressful movement. And this is another place. A lot of times what we don't understand is that intense, let's just say intense exercise, and even for some people mild exercise, if you don't have enough energy in the system to run it, you're going to turn again to adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol. And then what's going to happen is that you've put it all right back into the stress state. Now, a lot of people will say, a little bit of that stress is good for you. But we've gone past the point in this society where a little bit of stress works. So if we lived relaxed lifestyles, then a little bit of stress does work. There's a purpose for it. But in the way that we're living now, that doesn't. And you just shove it back down the pathway of inflammation, fibrosis, high estrogen, high cortisol, difficulty managing blood sugar, self-digestion of tissues, and turning off the thyroid response. So there's a big difference. Now, you also heal the adrenals by turning to the real power source. So even from a Chinese medicine perspective, that is supposed to be easy to digest food. So it kind of goes back to the like easy to digest, sufficient amounts of carbohydrates that are simple and cooked, avoiding polyunsaturated fats because they're pro-inflammatory and they interrupt that cycle. Making sure that you're balancing your carbs with your protein and your fats, avoiding anything but saturated fats. Eating according to your particular system. And there's some nuance here because that's not something that can necessarily be said for each person. And the emotional state. So worry, anxiety, and fear will actually interrupt even your best dietary efforts as well. So they have to be addressed. And sometimes you have to use nutrients or substances or herbs to turn that off, because sometimes we're so conditioned to a state of stress that you have to give a little nudge. But we have to get out of the emotional state of worry, fear, anxiety, overthinking, because those things injure this spleen network. And I was talking about that in the Chinese medicine model, that the energy is supposed to come from the spleen, which spleen has connections with thyroid and hypothalamus and pituitary as well. So it has to come from that system in order to avoid it coming from the stress-based model. So those things matter. Sometimes you have to balance out the progesterone versus estrogen. Simple carbs cooked. Vegetables can be a simple carb cooked, but you may need, most people cannot do it just with vegetables. I will be honest. They're going to need cooked fruits. They're going to need cooked grains. Some people cooked root vegetables, the tubers, squashes, those kind of things. And some people, depending on the person, we have to use things like honey, maple syrup. It just depends on their metabolism and how their cells work and how high their stress state is. That's why you have to be able to kind of check in with each person, because unfortunately it's not always so simple. But yes, you are going to need actual carbs, and no, it can't just be like so you can't make it all up with steamed vegetables as your carb. It won't work. It's not going to be sufficient. You're not going to have enough of the carbs, because your cells, their energy pathways run off of glucose and fructose. That's what stimulates mitochondrial respiration. If you don't have enough glucose and fructose there, your mitochondria will not have fuel. They will not run the Krebs cycle. You will make all your energy in the cytoplasm of the cell, and you will make 30 times less energy than if you were using glucose and fructose. And in the process, that's where we run the cortisol pathway. When we're doing the other pathway in the cytoplasm, that's where we get fibrosis, hyperestrogen, change to acid-base balance, shutting off the thyroid, all of those, the rapid aging pathway. That's why it's so important that we get out of that state. And what happens is that if we work on that healing pathway of the cell, the high mineral density foods, good carbohydrates, proteins that aren't too high in phosphorus, balancing our food throughout the day, not eating the polyunsaturated fats, only looking at saturated fats, doing all cooked foods, don't do any raw foods. Those are all things that'll start to build that spleen network and will allow it to heal, and it'll be building the energy at the cell and allow the cell to actually make energy, and then allow the body to say, okay, I don't need to rely on the adrenals for energy anymore. Then you have to protect it. So that's where all the paying attention to how you're operating in the world. Are you operating from fear, worry, anxiety, concern? Are you balancing that? Are you taking meditation time? Are you getting outside in nature? Are you avoiding intense exercise? Are you cutting out the situations in your life that are stressful to the best of your ability? Are you, asking for help when you need it? Are you delegating? Are you turning off the news? Don't scroll through Facebook all day long. Stop listening to things that excite you. Are you doing those things too because you have to guard it? Because let's say you get the other stuff dialed in and then you're still doing those things. You're invoking stress response all day long, every single day. And you'll wonder, why am I not healing? This is frustrating. I'm still stuck in this state. Now, a lot of people stack on top of this. Look, if you have a stressed adrenal system, you have a thyroid problem. I don't care what your labs say. I'm telling you straight up, you have a thyroid problem. Now, some people will say, well, then cool. Can't I just take some thyroid hormone? And the answer to that is no, you can't. Because here's the problem. When you take thyroid, it's awesome. It can replace a deficiency, but it is a metabolic regulator and it revs the metabolism. Not from a weight loss perspective. I'm not talking about weight loss. I'm talking about the way the cells work. So it revs the metabolism. If you don't have things in place for those cells to use as energy, if you don't have the nutrients there that they've been missing, if you've got a lot of polyunsaturated fats, if you're not eating enough carbohydrates, all of those things are going to negate the effect of thyroid. So unfortunately, and I know tons of you have probably experienced it, someone finally agrees to give you thyroid and you're like, what the heck? It didn't do anything. I don't feel any different. Or maybe I did for a little bit and then it went away. This is why. Because just giving thyroid doesn't repair the mechanism. You've still got a problem. It's just you've got more hormone now, but you don't have the mechanism repaired. And so as a consequence, in fact, giving thyroid to people who don't have these other things in place can rev the stress response even more, because in the absence of sufficient substrates to use the thyroid effectively, the body has to turn back and ask the cortisol to be produced to regulate the emergency power system once again. And it's a vicious cycle. And I see it every single day. People finally get put on thyroid and then this is what happens. And it's because you have to repair the mechanism. And it's not just a matter of one or two little tweaks. It ends up being slightly different for each person because we've all been disrupted in the same ways. These base parameters of, cooked foods, no polyunsaturated fats, and having good carbohydrates, low phosphorus proteins, those are consistent. But even that, we're all different sizes. We all need different amounts of those things. And then we all need different variables there. But it's just that big warning needs to go out that just replacing thyroid isn't going to work. And if you go turn off the stress response and you don't have these things in place, it's not going to work either, because you've turned off the only thing that was running the metabolism and running the cells. Now what do you have? It's you can't go to emergency power. It's just going to kick back in. And that's why the cycle continues. That's why a lot of people stay sick forever, because they're doing all these things, but they're finding that they keep seesawing. It's in and out of the trough because they can't get ahead of it because they've never fixed the real problem and they've never metabolically turned off the stress response. And so the inflammation just keeps building. It'll just show up someplace else. So you do all these things, you get it all balanced. And what do you do then? Well, one of the things you have to be really mindful for is that you really do avoid the state that got you there in the first place. So for a lot of people, that means changing a lot of our operating procedures in life and our mindset by which we operate and the model by which we view the world, because otherwise it's going to come back. Truth is, this world around us, it's crazy as it is. We can't escape that. Well, most of us can't. I mean, most people I know are not just going to go live in the middle of the woods somewhere and call it good. So we have to be able to deal with that world, nourish our bodies, keep the stress response low, nourish our organ systems, and have feedback mechanisms and practices we can use every single day to do that without needing more and more and more big intervention. And this is, again, why a lot of it fails, is because everyone's focused on let me just treat your adrenal insufficiency, but they're not working on any of the other aspects. They're not actually building a base. They're just dealing with one little fire that's over in one corner and not ever dealing with the rest of it. And the state of the body is ultimately determined by the state of the cell. And if the cell can't send messages and it can't move electrons around, then you'll be stuck in a low vibration state at some level in some way. So whether that's going to remain to be fatigue, maybe the fatigue clears a little bit, but now there's headaches, or there's hot flashes, or there's insomnia. Those are all patterns. The same thing with anxiety, depression. Those mood disorders are all part of this too. They're not separate from it. They're actually just other symptomology of this same thing. And it all comes down to the stress response. And in essence, turning to the adrenals as the primary force to run the body, or turning to that kidney network in the Chinese medicine model, and then not having the body run by its core places that actually have the ability to sustain. And so it always comes back to that basis of we have to nourish that, in Chinese medicine, nourish the spleen stomach model of the body with those cooked foods, with rest, with gentle movement, without intense exercise, avoiding worry, stress, anxiety, or dealing with those emotions, learning how to feel them and let them go, dealing with the need for nutrients that are missing, nourishing our gut, nourishing the liver, and focusing on that, using our breath work, using meditation, adjusting the levels for our particular imbalances, acid, base, mineral, vitamins, and taking the load off the kidneys so that they can restore, and being willing to do the work to get there. But I just know that too many people out there are saying it's just this, it's just that. And the reality is, you know, I just want you guys to all know you can't just turn off the stress response and not have built a foundation to replace it, because you're just setting yourself up for another crash. And it's something I've seen too many times. I want to make sure that you're not going to end up in that boat. Now, I do this every day. So this is the basis. I believe that fatigue and exhaustion and these patterns, not only is it about restoring our energy level, but that energy level is like putting us back into our, you know, divine alignment. It's restoring the movement of the force of creation in our body. And in reality, when I break it down all the way, the exhaustion, hormonal imbalances, gut issues, inflammation, rapid age, they are all signs of that disconnect that happens because we weren't taught how to nourish ourselves and stay in alignment. And that's what it's all about. So in all honesty, if you want help to do that, cool, reach out. Just really ask yourself great questions as you go through your life. You know, am I pushing too hard? Am I paying attention to what my body's needs are? What do I think the state of my life is? Am I running on stress? Do I like the effect of stress? And, you know, if you've been treating it, you know, ask yourself, have I been solely focused on kind of nourishing the adrenals and turning off all this stress and propping up the thyroid? Have I been focused on building the cell back and actually getting to the root of it? And do I know I'm turning off the stress response, or do I hope so? Because there is a big difference there. And in truth, every illness that we know and all the problems we associate with aging is because no one ever turned off the stress response. They just kept running with it, you know, silencing it, muting it, and eventually it took over. So that's my piece for today. You guys, if you want help, reach out. This is what we do every single day. This is the whole basis of everything I do in life, is teaching people how to have this for themselves and get their life back and build a foundation that works. You can be 100 years old and having fun, because I know that's my goal. So have a beautiful day. Thanks for being here. Blessings, guys.